Number 8. Sandra Anderson Ira. Until somewhat recently, 35-year-old Sandra Anderson Ira made a living as a fisherwoman and a legislator in Norway. She left her political career behind in early 2022 to volunteer as a combat medic in the Ukrainian war effort against invading Russian forces. In an interview with the New Voice of Ukraine, Ira explained that she'd never been to Ukraine before, but that she'd lived in northern Norway near the Russian border. She said that the people in the region knew that a war was coming between Russia and Ukraine well ahead of time, and that they had been preparing for it for years. Ira described the urge to join the fight as a moral obligation. She explained that the last time there was a major combat in Norway during World War II, other countries stepped in to help. Ira also pointed out that there are individual reasons for joining the war. While she personally felt a calling to become a medic, many are accustomed to war, or at least trained for it, and are simply returning to do what they do best. When it came to deciding whether to join the fight, it was a no-brainer for Ira. She said that she didn't even need any time to think about it, but that she was instantly committed to doing what she could to help. At first, she didn't tell many people about her decision. She didn't want her friends and family to worry about her, which would have caused her to lose focus on her mission. Her loved ones mostly found out that she was in Ukraine from the media, but they've been supportive of her decision and are hoping she returns home safely. Number 7. Alex Druk and Andy Tai Huynh. U.S. military veterans 40-year-old Alex Druk and 27-year-old Andy Tai Huynh were among the first several hundred Americans to volunteer in the Russo-Ukrainian War in early 2022. They did this against the advice of the U.S. Department of State, which warned the men that it was extremely dangerous to fight against Russia. The pair ignored the warnings and joined a unit of foreign fighters called the International Legion of Territorial Defense of Ukraine. Several months after arriving in the country, the men found themselves in a situation that would terrify most people. Russian forces attacked the pro-Ukrainian unit they were fighting with outside Kharkiv. They were left alone, abandoned by their unit, as they would later describe, so they attempted to hike back to their base. However, before they made it to their destination, they were taken prisoner by the Russians and held in captivity in Russia for the next 104 days. What they experienced was nothing short of sheer torture and suffering. Druk and Huynh were blindfolded before being brutally interrogated. They were abused both psychologically and physically, and they were given very little food and water. They were initially held at a Russian detention complex resembling a tent city, but were later moved to a more private site where they endured even worse treatment. Their final stop was at a site they later described as a more traditional Russian prison. After more than 3 grueling months, the Russians agreed to give Druk and Huynh back to the U.S. in a prisoner swap. After being released, the men told the Associated Press that the last 24 hours of captivity, which mainly involved their transport back to safety, were their most torturous. Their hands and feet were bound and bags were placed tightly over their heads as they rode blindly to their next destination. The whole time they wondered if they would really ever make it back to the U.S. During their first extensive interview with the press in late 2022, the men declined to go into detail about the torture they endured, but they had visible injuries on their wrists and head and were both underweight, having lost somewhere between 20 and 30 pounds. Speaking with the Washington Post, Druk said that the Russians believed that he and Huynh were members of the CIA or held some other top-secret status within the U.S. government. In fact, the men who interrogated them were convinced of it. Number 6. Tseng Sheng Guang. Tseng Sheng Guang was born in Taiwan to a family from the indigenous Sakizaya tribe. He spent part of his childhood in Belize before returning to Taiwan, becoming multilingual in the process. He learned English, Taiwanese Mandarin, and Spanish on top of already knowing his ethnic language, Amis. After graduating high school in 2016, Tseng joined the Taiwanese military. He served for 5 years and was honorably discharged in 2021. 3 months into the Russian invasion into Ukraine, he volunteered in the Legion of Territorial Defense of Ukraine. In September of 2022, Tseng joined the ranks of a police unit called the Carpathian Sich Battalion. He fought along the front lines of Luhansk Oblast in Ukraine's easternmost region. In early November, Tseng was mortally wounded in a mortar bombardment. He suffered a head injury, a broken left leg, and other injuries, and he bled to death in a country he'd never stepped foot in prior to joining the war effort. Tseng was the first East Asian fighter to die in the Russo-Ukrainian War. Out of the thousands of foreign soldiers who volunteered in the war, only around 10 of them are from Taiwan. At his funeral, Tseng's mother praised her son's bravery. The Taiwanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs commended the young man for his willingness to give his life fighting for Ukraine's freedom, a value that Taiwan resonates with as it grapples in its own struggle for independence against China. Number 5. Brian Young. Originally from California, 51-year-old U.S. Army veteran Brian Young and his partner, Julia, were living in Tbilisi, Georgia when Russia invaded Ukraine in early 2022. Young wanted to volunteer to fight for Ukraine, but Julia didn't want him to, and they got into a heated argument about it. Julia didn't understand Young's sense of duty, but he told her he felt an obligation to protect the free world. She later told Business Insider that the next time she called him, he was already on his way to Ukraine, leaving her without the opportunity to even say goodbye. He left to join the war efforts about a month after everything started. Young joined the Ivan Buhun Brigade, a special forces unit run by Ukrainian intelligence. Most members have battlefield experience and are highly skilled, making him an ideal fit for the unit. Young, who served as an infantryman in the U.S. military from 1990 to 2003, retired from his military career due to an injury. The opportunity to defend Ukraine gave him a reason to put his skills to use, and he found a renewed sense of purpose after 2 years of isolating for COVID-19 lockdowns. Shortly after he arrived, however, he began sending Julia troubling messages about the disorganization and lack of equipment among his unit. Young told his partner that the way things were being done reflected the methods of the old days, despite the brigade's prestige as a unit for skilled soldiers. Julia received a concerning text message from Young in June, stating that most of the foreign volunteers had left and that there were only a few of them remaining. He described the situation he was in as a mess. A few weeks later, Young's unit was deployed to the Ukraine's Ryarovka region, which was under heavy attack by the Russians at the time. By then, the brigade had narrowly escaped death several times, according to an anonymous American volunteer who fought alongside Young. The man, known only as AJ, told Insider that the mission was a disaster from the start. Young lost his life during one of these attacks. Based on what he told Julia, she's been left wondering if his death was preventable. But at the end of the day, his devotion to democracy drove his decision to continue fighting, and he chose to stay in Ukraine even after realizing that he was in a precarious and highly dangerous situation. Number 4. Trevor Kjeldal. 40-year-old Trevor Kjeldal had no military experience when he left his life in China behind to help defend Ukraine against Russia in July of 2022. Originally from Brisbane, Australia, the married father and his friend James DeRose were initially turned away when they tried to join the International Legion of Ukraine due to their inexperience. But according to DeRose, who spoke with the Today Show in late 2022, Kjeldal was determined to contribute to the war effort and had no plans to leave the country until it was over. The duo's motivation eventually landed them in a combat unit, especially as many foreign fighters turned around and went home. Kjeldal, who went by the nickname Ninja, sustained serious injuries pretty early on in the conflict during a Russian ambush, but he was back on the front lines as soon as he was healthy enough to fight again. In July, Kjeldal said that he booked his ticket to Ukraine as soon as he heard that President Volodymyr Zelensky was calling for foreign volunteers to join. The ambitious first-time fighter was inspired by the Ukrainian people's bravery and resilience. Unfortunately, he lost his life in late October in the Donbass region during a Russian attack. DeRose remembered his friend as having a heart of gold, always thinking of his wife and child, and being a good soldier. Number 3. Julia Schiff. 23-year-old fighter pilot Julia Schiff was kicked out of the Italian Air Force after she complained about being brutally hazed and bullied. 8 of her superiors allegedly bashed her head against the wing of an airplane and whipped her backside before throwing her into a swimming pool. Footage of the disturbing initiation surfaced, and Julia took the suspected offenders to court. But unfortunately, this did nothing to change her standing with the military. Instead, her official reason for being discharged was listed as insufficient military aptitude. Julia's wrongful dismissal case was eventually taken to Italy's highest court, but in the end, she lost. It apparently didn't matter that she excelled at her training and came in 4th place out of nearly 2,000 applicants. According to the Italian military, the incident reflected an age-old tradition that marks the end of a cadet's training. When Russia invaded Ukraine in early 2022, Julia saw it as her chance to pursue a military career outside of Italy. She joined the country's special forces, where her skills and service are both wanted and appreciated. She was then shipped off to Kyiv. After arriving in Ukraine, Julia began filming her own personal documentary about her experience for the satirical and investigative reporting La Ligne. And she's proving to the world that she is, in fact, cut out for a military career. Number 2. Luke Lusashin. 31-year-old father of 2, Luke Skywalker Lusashin, left behind his life in the U.S. to volunteer in Ukraine as a combat medic, much to his family's dismay. They repeatedly begged him to come home, but he remained dedicated to the war effort and stayed put. Luke's father, George, who now lives in North Carolina, told NBC News that his son felt compelled to volunteer because he's from Ukraine. George went on to say that his son didn't join the war to be a hero, but because he wanted to help people in need. The concerned father said that he was among the family members who tried to talk Luke out of joining. Luke's mother said that she became even more worried when her son sent her a message saying that his unit lacked proper equipment. He asked his mom to send him a tactical vest, but even if she did, Luke wouldn't have received it in time to prevent his death in the country's eastern Donbass region in July of 2022. The dedicated soldier's parents were awakened by a call from the U.S. State Department at 4 o'clock in the morning, informing them of Luke's death. His commander, Ruslan Miroshnichenko, expressed deep grief at the loss of Luke and 3 other foreign fighters that were killed by an ambush of Russian tanks. When Miroshnichenko asked Luke why he was willing to put his life on the line for another country, he responded by saying that if action wasn't taken against Russia now, the country's next step would be to knock on America's door. In other words, he felt like the U.S. needed to help Ukraine fight in order to preserve both countries' freedom. And at number 1, Paul the Paratrooper. Within 2 months of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in late February 2022, more than 10,000 volunteers from other countries joined the fight. Around 3,000 of them were Americans, and included among them was a former paratrooper and Iraq veteran from Texas named Paul. His last name was withheld from the press for security reasons, but he was happy to talk to the new voice of Ukraine about how he made the decision to join the fight. Paul said that he wanted to live in Europe all his life. He moved to Kyiv in 2020 before the current war between Russia and Ukraine broke out, and has since been granted residence there. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Paul found that the lifestyle changes in Ukraine were easier to deal with than the restrictions back in the US. He was also impressed by the country's patriotism and national pride, which he felt were similar to American values. Paul's first job in Ukraine was at a veteran center, where he taught English to former service members. They developed a bond, and at a time when many Americans went back to the U.S., he felt compelled to stay. He joined a military unit called the Georgian National Legion, which consists mostly of ethnically Georgian soldiers. The Georgian National Legion was established in 2014 and is currently under the command of the Ukrainian Army. The unit Paul belongs to has been fighting since day one of the war. He said that he's especially inspired to fight right now because the ongoing conflict isn't a war about money, but a war for people. Paul believes that fighting in the war means fighting for the very concept of freedom. If your country insisted on it, would you join the front lines of the Ukrainian resistance in Russia? Or would you stay out of it and let Ukraine and Russia work it out amongst themselves? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.